been supported by Roche since 2010, but we didn't have a lot of presence in it. So what we did is we went out and started talking to labs. I'm pretty sure many labs in this conference actually have been part of this survey, and we went and did this survey in the different labs, and we really got the data together, and then that's where we increased the participation of India. Now, what we're actually talking about in this survey is the operational aspect of a lab. And we've broken it down into 3 areas in terms of quality, in terms of speed, in terms of cost. Now, what we're doing is over the years, we've got over 35,000 submissions since 2010, and we've got 20 countries. In this year's survey, also that was a survey that ended in 2021, so 2019 to 21, we've got over 1,200 labs across the APAC region, so across 20 countries, and what we're trying to do is present this data back to you. Now, please understand that this is the data that we've got. I'm showing you this data because there's a lot of perspective. It's a big task to actually gather lab data and get them together on one platform. The second thing is that whenever you look at this data, you always have to have, there are many questions you can ask the data, but also there's a perspective that you have to have in mind saying that this is what was asked in this room, or this is where the data lies. So what I wanted to tell you is this. We've had, what we're doing is we've classified, and I'll go a little more detail in the countries that participated, but essentially we over 1,200 labs across 20 countries, government, private, and commercial. Now, if you look at this, yeah. So we've got a lot of countries in developing countries. I know that may sound a little retro, calling it developing countries, but we don't mean it in terms of developing countries. I'll explain to you what that means. And we're looking at developed countries. So essentially, when we're looking at the labs, this is the participation that we see across countries. I'm showing you this because there's a large data set from China, but there's also a large data set from countries like Thailand, Vietnam, Japan, India, Indonesia, and Philippines. So now this is a very important data set. How we've segregated that is developed countries and developing countries. Now, why we call them developed countries? Because these were countries that we looked at that had set infrastructure, are looked at as stalwart. So if you look at the countries that are there, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, and a few 2 non-APAC countries, which is essentially Germany in this case. But these were the countries that we said that these were looked at as one kind of standard in the general population. And the other set, we looked at India, countries like India, Thailand, Vietnam, China. So this was the other set that we arranged. So when you're looking at the data, you're looking at Indian labs, you're looking at developed country labs, which is defined by the set, and then you're looking at developing country labs. Now, once you see this, there are many learnings. We were very surprised with the data because there were many learnings from different countries, and that's why we wanted to present to you today. So this is, just go back. This is India here. Yeah. So that's India, there's a blue mark there. It's India in the country that we have there, 96 participations, which took quite a bit of an effort. Yeah. So if we look at this now, one important thing to realize is that when we did go into these labs, what we did find is that primarily the labs that we did get data from were mid-sized labs. And by mid-size, I'm talking about sample volume, and sample volume, I'm talking about 250 to 1,000 samples. I'm pretty sure that most labs in India and most labs in most countries will fit into this number of sample volume. So this is representative of those labs. So you've got about 250 to 1,000 samples a day across the labs. Now, a very important part is that a lot of this in India, the context is it's more, in China it would be government labs, but in India it would be private and commercial labs. So, small hospitals, again here, small hospitals defined as less than 0 to 500 beds. That's where a lot of the bulk that came in from India. You have medium-sized and large-sized hospitals, but essentially small medium up to 500 bed, and that's how it is. We're defining it differently. Small labs, medium labs, 250 samples a day. If you look at the bottom corner of the graph there, that's private labs and private commercial labs. So with those 3 slides, I just wanted to set the context of this is what was, these are the people who were surveyed, this was the context in which it was taken. And then we went on and asked questions. Now, first questions is everyone is talking today about accreditation. This was one thing that surprised really us, is that as compared to developed and developing countries, India was the one who was really driven towards accreditation. If you can see in this first graph here, India was focused on accreditation. If you see the most common accreditation that we were focused on is ISO 15189, which we just heard from Roshinwasa. The other two was very interestingly ISO 9000 and CAP. So those were the ones that were that really showed up on a radar. That's for India. The rest were so and so. In fact, some of the countries who actually came back and or the region came back and said, why isn't India looking at ISO 15190, which is about safety in the lab? So that's something that India, I mean, as the survey population, we didn't look at that ISO standard. But that's where it is. Now, when we ask this question is, why was it that developed countries and why is there such a big gap? Why aren't developing countries or developed countries not looking at accreditation? What we discovered was that in Japan and Korea, because of two things: language barriers, the fact that there was a lot of accreditations were in English, and the fact that they had their own internal standards. They didn't pass it.
Is this percentage with reference to the 256 labs or?
Yes.
Okay.
So if you look at in the percentage, the number. So percentage in reference to the number that we got down. So each time. So when I'm talking about development, this is the percentage of labs within that category that participated in accreditation.
And random survey.
When we looked at EQUAS, again, that's another place where India really strove. So in the 96 96 labs that we asked in India, everyone was very focused on EQUAS. Shout out to Dr. Pamela here. I know we don't have CMC data on this because it wasn't part of the question, but because we had a section that said what other accreditation that they use, what other EQUAS that they use, we've got about 1/3 or a little more than 1/3 of the data actually saying that they're using CMC EQUAS. So that was a very popular EQUAS that was done. Biorad, which was basically the EQUAS that was done in India, was the most common, and after that was Randox. Randox was very popular in Philippines for some reason. They've got a good market there. That's what was the message that came of this. So, in essence, the EQUAS for most other countries, because they've got strong regulation or what, as we understand, within the country itself. So whether the developed countries, you see the EQUAS programs are very low. In the developed countries, it's like 14%. But the fact is that they had their own internal quality programs that they really relied on versus on EQUAS programs. So that was strange for us. And that was, why we're showing this is we just wanted to show you that there was this segregation. So I know that we're thinking about EQUAS there, but there was a segregation. That was interesting to understand. Now this is very important. As part of EQUAS, as part of accreditation, you have to do continuous improvement programs. What was very important for India, again, India scores very high in that because as part of accreditation, they went into continuous improvement programs. What was interesting is that there was feedback, customer training and employee, you've got customer satisfaction survey, employee measurement survey, all of these were there. What we were surprised by, and this comes from from a background where we're a diagnostic company, is lean. Now, lean is a very important exercise where we're talking about visualization of the lab. So you look at all the processes in the lab, visualize that process in your lab, and that's visualizing the actual process in your lab. So you're documenting the process, and then you're measuring it in terms of time. So your value-added stream, your value mapping that you're doing, you're looking at value stream mapping that you're doing. You're looking at number of people that were in the lab, number of times, how much your batch sizes. So you're looking at that, but that didn't seem to be a very strong practice in India, and we were really wondering why. Because it's actually one of the most easiest exercises to do within your lab, and it's something that reveals a lot about a lab. So that's something that we wanted to do, and that's one that we wanted to bring out into discussions. When it came down to this key performance indicators, the three ones that struck us were external QC, sample rejection rate, and turnaround time. That was the top of the markers that came down. Six Sigma was appreciated, understood, but not really practiced, and this is India data. However, another concept of workspace utilization. Now, what's happening is that with the number of tests that are increasing, what's happening is that a lot of instruments are being put into a lab, and lab real estate is becoming something that is becoming difficult to manage. But people are not looking at workspace utilization and how that's going in. So that's one thing that we're also looking at. When it came down to sample quality check, so there are solutions. A lot of developing countries, interestingly, 61% of them said that they actually use the analytical instrument. And when we asked why use an analytical instrument to actually do sample checks? So you're looking at icterus, hemolysis, or why are you looking at analytical. They said that when it comes down to quality, we won't compromise on quality when it comes down to doing the test. We'd rather go on doing these tests, taking the hit on that and taking the hit on the cost that will come with this, because many instruments do have an added cost for analytical sample check. However, they were okay with that. But again, many of them did a manual check, but that's something that was interesting from our point of view. IT infrastructure, this was a very interesting component because everyone said that they were very comfortable with LIS, but the idea of middleware, which was something that a lot of the topics that were discussed about, how when you're, especially if I have to refer to Dr. Pamela's discussion, saying that I need documentation of quality, all my QC that has been there over time. I need documentation, or I need to see how I need a way to generate reports over time. I need to have my data delivered to me in time. Now, if I have a middleware, that's exactly what middleware is developed for. And the fact that when I'm looking at middleware, because all my data is going into that, there are many functionalities in terms of this problematic QC accumulation that is addressed in middleware, and that's where it really helps. One very interesting part is auto-validation. So if I have to look down in the bottom here, we're talking about auto-validation. And auto-validation, how we like to define it, is a 5-level auto-validation. Now, let me start with auto-validation. Auto-validation is known to everyone, but essentially when it comes down to auto-validation, what it helps you do is, when you're looking at large labs, especially labs that are going above 500 or 800, you're looking at large labs, the sample or test volumes really skyrocket. In that sense, you really have to remove the clutter that normals cause, because you have a lot of normals in there, and you really have to focus within that set, because of your reduced manpower or number of pathologists there, to reduce and effectively focus on the ones that are abnormal. In that case, that's where auto-validation really helps. So you're looking at a 5-level auto-validation. 1, you were basically checking on whether the range was correct. 2, you were checking on instrument flag. 3, you were checking on QC parameters. 4, you were checking on logics. So basically, because there's interrelationship between tests, can I program that basic logic in the system so that I can use those logics on the fly for every test that is run? So it doesn't require manually to check those logics. These are logics that are automatically checked whilst the tests are done. The last one is the delta check, which is past data, and that really requires you to store long-term data. But yeah, that was the level that we were talking about. So those are areas that we really thought were important, and on those areas that we thought would make sense to carry on discussions with. Very interesting was a stat lab. So there were 3 entries in India that said they had a stat lab. But when we asked what was, our question back to APAC was, what was a stat lab? Now the variation of the description was very different. A stat lab varied from anything with a POC instrument to a stat lab that had a complete parallel instrumentation to the laboratory. It could have been under the laboratory that is working in a separate region, or it could be under the department to increase the turnaround time. But the only definition that made sense, and it is across APAC region, was the fact that a stat lab is a lab that allows us quick turnaround time. That was the only definition that we get. So that really brought us to the second other parts, is that what do I look at speed? Now, if I have to look at speed, most of the survey answers say, if I have to look at chemistry, my target, I'm not talking about my actual, but my target turnaround time was greater than 180 minutes. Whilst if I have to look at the developing countries, which is this gray bar here, they're looking at a chemistry turnaround time of 60 minutes. Now, if I have to go further, we're looking at an immunoassay turnaround time of 180 minutes, which is that orange line there at the end, versus the developed countries who are looking at target turnaround time for immunology at 60 minutes. So what we're saying is that there is a perception where, depending on the quality of services that I want to provide to my clinicians, I needed to have a faster turnaround time and to set my target. So target's always great because you want to hit a point, but many times for most of the tests you may get further away from it. But yeah, so am I really benchmarking further away from what my peers in the region are doing, or should I look at that? Stat test for immunology associated with that. The other part is when I'm looking at productivity in terms of staff productivity, where I'm looking at number of tests that I should get per staff. I know it's FTE, but what happens is that when we try to discuss FTE or full-time equivalent for a person, to come down to a definition because of the varying shifts, because of the number of levels within the lab, how do I accumulate that? So we kind of moved away from the definition of an FTE, and we said what was a full-time staff. So full-time staff is anybody who was within the lab who had an action on the test, who was ready to test. If I count them in, what is the number of tests that I should do to make that staff viable, or to make that staff really, I mean, where do I lay in the benchmarks in that? So in that, again, India falls short, where I'm looking at developed countries as saying about 300 tests per, 300 samples per full-time staff, versus us, where we're looking at between 40 to 50 full-time staff per sample. These are samples. Tests will go further on, because then it really depends on the test density. So certain, like China had a very high test density of 10 to 12, whilst other countries didn't have that high test density. So it was very difficult to stabilize on test density, but in terms of samples, we were very confident saying that for a particular lab, you really need to look at, and a particular number of staff, you really need to look at that. So just in terms of space, we have this discussion as well. So, and in instruments. So just to close, so we were looking at all of these matrices. These are very simple matrices, easy to get at, but collecting these matrices and having people align on it and come to a conclusion where was the task was. And what it helped us was there was a great discussion that happened, and then we went on forward to understand what these criteria were and how these matrices play. What we're trying to do next is to encourage more participation in India, so that we had a better idea of what, or the community could come to a better understanding of what matrices really describe the operational aspects of the lab well, and how we could go forward with that. So these are different publications that have been that have come off Labinsights up to the latest one in 2020. So all of these are basically from different countries. In fact, we've got the first one here coming out from India, where it was the first participation of 20 labs. But we did have it across the board. So we're looking at cooperating with organizations like Kahokon, or an organization to establish this. When we're looking at labs, when we're looking at operations of the lab, is there a common metrics that we can look at? How can we help in this field? These are areas that I think are important for you as running the lab and understanding the lab better, and really considering the operational efficiencies of the lab. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richard, on elucidating on the benchmarking of labs across countries in terms of quality, speed, and cost. The floor is open for questions.
Any questions?
All these strategies, are they related to Roche customers only?
No, sir. We went as many customers as we could. I can't comment about APAC, but for us, whoever we had access to, primarily because this data validation takes two processes. Just filling a survey doesn't really make sense. Somebody has to be there from our team to make sure that that survey is filled correctly and you understand it properly. Because what we understood is that the questions have to be so basic that you have to be able to understand it in the same context. So we went through all the questions.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Richard and Dr. Anila Matin.